Hey there kids, it's me, MrCreepyPasta, and before we get started on tonight's story, I'm going to let you know about one quick service. It's a service that I use, as well as I think literally every other horror creator on YouTube, because they're basically quintessential. It's called Shudder. Shudder is the ultimate streaming service for horror. It brings you new original movies every week to keep you thrilled and chilled all winter long. In the coming-of-age horror Slapface, a bullied boy finds an ally in a monster rumored to live in a nearby woods. All the Moons is a mesmerizing vampire epic about a young orphan girl given a cursed gift of immortality. And They Live in the Gray sees a child welfare worker face off against insidiously angry ghosts. In celebration of Black History Month, Shudder is excited to add Tales from the Hood 1 and 2, Jada Pinkett Smith's Tales from the Crypt, Demon Knight, and Alaya's Queen of the Damned to its horror noir collection. If you're like me, and you've got basically every streaming service, and you've been struggling to find an actual good list of horror films, then you'll enjoy Shudder. I mean, that's the whole reason that I have it, is because if I want to find a horror film, especially like one of the classics, then this is going to be the place to be able to see horror. Especially, I've been enjoying watching classic things. Creepshow 2, I think, is one of the more fun movies I've ever watched, like horror movies I've ever watched in my life. And there's this one segment in it about this spot in the water that, I don't know, it really gets me. I always hate things in the water, and this is one of the ones. You can watch it for yourself, believe me. So, get started streaming the best horror, thriller, and supernatural content. Shudder's expertly curated collection includes must-sees like VHS 94, The Boy Behind the Door, and PG Psycho Goreman. Psycho Goreman, which I'll tell you right now, is a literal must-see. This is not in a script, I'm telling you. Psycho Goreman is a must-see movie, plus all of the best horror documentaries and the hit Creepshow TV show series, which is a TV show series taken from Creepshow 2, which I talked about earlier, from the executive producer Greg Nicotero of The Walking Dead. So try Shudder for free for 30 days. You can just go over to shudder.com and use promo code CreepyPasta, that's SHUDDER.com, and you can use Creepypasta, like the channel you're watching right now. It's free for 30 days. Go watch Creepshow. I mean, seriously, check it out. Or you can use that link in the description down below. And now, on to tonight's story. Journal entry 1 of subject 6. A man has stolen my face. In return, he's given me someone else's. He's actually given me many faces, though. Some he's taken back. Others I've kept. I've hung them on the walls of this place. It's a circular room like a pit with dark stony walls from which fall riles of gray water. I drink the water, I eat the black muck that accumulates on the floor. I think I might be at the bottom of a well. But it's fairly large, and I've never seen any light pour down from the top. The floor somehow emits a faint luminescence of its own, and it's by this light that I carry out my daily tasks. But beyond this, there isn't much to note. The man always enters via a thick iron door, something like what you'd think to find in some subterranean vault, which supports my belief that this isn't some well, but a dungeon. I don't know how long I've been here, nor how long I'll remain. He doesn't speak to me much, only comes to bring me new faces, or occasionally take one away. I don't know what's happened to my face. I don't know what he does with other faces. He always comes in wearing one, usually one that's different from the one before, though sometimes he wears the same face all day or week. The increments of time are hard to judge in near complete darkness. I can't tell how long I sleep because my sleeps are inconsistent in length. The faces around me make it hard to rest. They're very chatty. I suppose I could also attribute some of the difficulty to my lack of eyelids. I find staring very rude, but with faces all around me, I can't help it. I can't look at the luminous floor. It would only make it harder to sleep. I've given up on trying to escape. The walls are too slick to climb, the vault door is impenetrable, and the faces whisper discouraging things to me, or guilt me out of trying to think of new ways to escape. They're lonely. And even though I've arranged them around the circular walls so that they can peer on each other, they look at me for comfort and companionship. I suppose I can understand most of them are hideous, and while I'm not very prideful of my appearance, I imagine I'm a much better sight than Sharon, or David, and especially Greg. Greg's face is mangled, as if it had been chewed on by dogs before being taken from him. The other faces sometimes bully Greg. I'd normally intervene, but Greg's personality matches his face very, very ugly. I've named the faces, but I have no idea if the names I've given them are close to their actual names. They seem to like them, though. No one ever argues when I call them by a new name, even when I forget and call them by a wrong new name. He doesn't know I've named them. I assume he has his own names for them, if he doesn't know their real ones. When he gives them to me, he usually says something like, "Oh yes, I think this one will fit you quite well, much better than the last." I suppose he's trying to find the perfect face to fit me. I also suppose he's forgotten that he took my face. I miss it. But I guess I have no other choice but to accept the faces and hope that one will match. The closest I've had to my own face was Bryce's. It was a snug fit. I could move my muscles comfortably beneath it and smile and frown. But when he entered and saw me frowning in it, he said, "Don't frown. You haven't the face for it. You're a smiler. But if you insist upon the grimace, I can fetch you a face more suitable for such rudeness." He then ripped Bryce's face off of me and left me with the others. I liked Bryce's face. Yesterday, or earlier today, or last week, I honestly can't tell anymore, and it's pointless to try. A hole opened up in the wall right where Andrew's face was. Poor Andrew fell face first to the floor, and I hurried and scooped him up next to Candace. She received him warmly, and I left him to become acquainted. The hole in the wall where Andrew had been was about face-sized, and there was a light that shone from it. I went over and I peered in, and I saw a man at a desk facing me. He was wearing a face that I hadn't seen before, one without any of the gunk or the smears that usually stain the faces. He greeted me, and I ran away, embarrassed to be seen unfaced. I quickly chose one I felt would best represent myself, and I returned, smiling as best I could. It wasn't quite like Bryce's, but it was good enough, suitable for the occasion. The man had patiently waited, and upon my return he greeted me again, and I told him the name of the face, and he greeted the face as well. He then offered me a pen, which I accepted, and then told me to write down my thoughts, my fears, my wants, etc. Later he said he'd return and take them. It would type them up for me and show them to the world. I didn't ask why he wanted to, didn't really want or care to know. It was just nice to know that someone was interested in me, the real me, beneath a stranger's face. I agreed, and he smiled and clapped his hands. But then I realized I didn't have anything to write on, and I told him so. But he wasn't disappointed or upset or embarrassed, and told me to wait a moment. Since he had been so patient with me, I nodded, and he left the desk, removing himself from my view. The room behind him was small, lit by a lamp on a dresser behind the desk. The walls were yellow, or made to appear so in the light of the lamp. There was a bed, low to the ground and well made. A laptop rested on the bed, closed shut, with its charger plugged into a socket in the wall. Despite the weakness of the bulb, the lamplight had almost blinded me when seen head-on, and I turned away from it. All the faces were very curious and whispered their questions, but I hissed at them and told them to shut up. The man in the hole returned a few moments later, and I was glad when he situated himself right in front of the harsh light. He handed me a roll of material and told me to write on it. I thanked him. He nodded, then covered the hole. I went and retrieved Andrew's face and returned it to the spot. The faces were quite fond of where I hanged them, and I asked if he enjoyed his visit with Candace. The mouth was agape as if he'd been screaming when he was taken from his body. But he told me that he enjoyed his time with Candace, that she was very well-mannered despite her disagreeable political views. He said that he wanted some time to think on whether or not she was worth having as a friend, so I patted his cheek and left him to reflect. The roll of material turned out to be some kind of thick paper or parchment, though it's inconsistently colored, as if it had been dipped in various dyes during preparation. Some parts are vanilla-colored, others are darker, some even as pale as ivory. The whole thing is about the size of a game board, but not as square, thicker in areas, but otherwise suitable for writing. It's what I've been writing on for the last 20 minutes or so. The pen is a regular pen. Black ink. Flows comfortably. It's obviously a bit harder to see in the darker section of material, so I occasionally have to apply a little more pressure, and weirdly, this sometimes results in material peeling away in a really sickening fashion. I've had to ask the normal-faced man if he has more of the material should I need to recopy the thoughts I've written on the ruined parts. I must also ask him for a light. My only writing surface is the floor, and its light isn't strong enough to shine through the paper. Everyone wants to be mentioned. They've been tirelessly insisting upon being name-dropped in the story or journal, or whatever you'd call this. Mark has been considerably incessant. Well, here you go, Mark. You've been mentioned. Carol, however, hasn't made a single plea, so I'll give her plenty of mentions. Carol is nice and friendly, and her face is solemn and respectful. She presents herself well, unlike many of the others who let their mouths hang open or eye sockets stare horrifically. I should probably wash them, being their caretaker and all, but I haven't any soap or towels, and if I did, I'd use them to clean my own flesh, which constantly, incessantly itches. If I scratch it, there's a terrible pain. Really just awful, inexpressible agony. And he hasn't seen fit to provide me with anything to treat it. I hurt. Always. Especially after wearing a face for too long. Splashing the wall water on myself only causes my face flesh to burn terribly. Last time I did that, I lost consciousness. The pain had been that bad. I don't want to even imagine what would happen if I were to slather the floor gunk on my face. Tastes horrible enough. I think I'm going to go to sleep now. I like to rest against the wall beneath Luke and Christopher. I doubt they're a couple, but I like to see them as so. They're both very kind-looking, even though Luke's mouth stretches all the way up to his ears, and his nose is missing. It's really horrendous. But still, he seems like he'd be kind if he were alive. I can't really close my eyes anymore, so I just sit beneath those two and I wait for my brain to just shut off. I'm going to roll the journal up and tuck it beneath me so that if he enters, he won't see it. He doesn't make me stand up or anything, usually just rips the face right off my head without bothering to make me look at him, so I can sit here, and even if he comes in to take a face or give me one, he won't see the roll. I can't wait to share my story with the man in the hole. I wonder what he's going to do with it. I hope he publishes the journals to a big audience so that everyone will know how brave I've been despite the horrifying circumstances, and how well I've taken care of the poor faces. I think I'd be really, really good at doing it professionally. I'm much better at this than I was at being a pharmacy tech. I wonder if anybody's noticed my absence. Surely they've at least started to wonder. Nothing else to add for now. I'd really like my face back, or maybe even Bryce's. I'd really like to go home, but I'm scared that if I ask to again, he'll take away the faces as punishment. And while it's dreadful and terrifying and dark here, I at least have company. Without them, I think I'd lose my mind. Good night. Journal entry number 2 of Subject 6. I've gained a few new faces, but none of them fit me very well. They're all fairly ugly. Must have been treated poorly in the man's care. They're all in pretty pitiable, almost wretched states. I'll take much better care of them, but I don't think there's anything I'll be able to do about their ragged and tarnished features. I've named them Frank, Hector, and Leah. Frank and Leah are married, or so I've imagined. Well, Hector hasn't yet recovered from the death of his wife. He's not quite ready to date again. The rest of the gang has accepted them wholeheartedly, even perpetually embittered Greg. I'm glad everyone's getting along. It's uplifting. My spirits have been pretty low ever since I found out the man in the hole, my would-be publisher, is dead. He appeared again a few hours ago, beckoned me to the hole in the wall behind Andrew. His voice had carried through Andrew's face, and upon hearing it, Andrew began screaming in terror. I rushed over to him, plucked him off the wall, and put him next to Candace, who kindly helped me to soothe the poor guy. Then, taking another face, I dressed myself and I went over to the hole to greet my guest. Sitting again behind the desk, in the sparsely furnished and harshly lit room, he asked if I had written out my thoughts yet. I told him that I had, excused myself so I could go grab the roll of paper, which I had hidden in the very back of the room, behind a mound of the hardened gunk. Bringing it back, I fed the roll through the hole and waited with bated breath, excited to hear what he thought of my journal. He warmly accepted it, smiling broadly with his beautiful, real, pleasantly natural face, and unrolled the paper upon the desk. I blanched and audibly gasped at seeing a few stains on the edges, but he didn't care. He wiped those away, and wiped away those that he could, then began reading. His eyes scanned the paper hungrily, but his expression had relaxed, appearing neither impressed nor disappointed. I was beyond nervous, and I kept making unnecessary and occasionally even uncomfortable adjustments to my borrowed face every couple of seconds as I waited. Finally, he reached the bottom. He looked up to me. For a moment he was speechless, expressively passive. A smile stretched across his face. He said that he loved it. I nearly fainted. I'd been so nervous. He asked if I would mind continuing the work, saying that my audience would be desperate for more. Told him that I had already planned to continue writing for as long as I remained here. His smile broadened. He was really quite handsome. And he passed along a few more blank pages, keeping the one that I'd given him. I accepted the new canvases gratefully, and asked if he'd like me to focus on anything in particular. But just as he was about to say something, there was a knock from somewhere within the room, and a look of annoyance overcame his face. He excused himself and he rose from the desk. And then he walked briskly to the immediate left of the hole, out of sight. I waited, still beaming with gratitude and pride at having my work complimented. I heard some whispering, the beginnings of some heated, though hushed exchange, followed by a soft thunk, which I thought nothing of in a moment. There were a few more sounds, most unrecognizable, and then he returned and he sat down at the desk. But it wasn't him. The person was wearing the same face, but it was now ill-fitting, too taut around the nose, too loose at the chin. And the whole thing was spattered with droplets of blood. The eyes weren't right either. They were now black and ugly, whereas before they'd been green, glimmering. But before I could comment on the incongruities in his appearance, he asked if I wouldn't mind reviewing what he had discussed. And not wanting to seem impolite, I complied, even though I knew that he wasn't the man with whom I'd been speaking moments ago. He nodded along, asking for clarification when I mentioned the new sheets of paper, which I showed him. Then he held up his hand in a gesture of pause, so that he could read for the first time, the journal entry I'd showed the former wearer of his face. Upon finishing, he nodded, and dispassionately thanked me for my contribution. Then he told me that I was free to go. I thanked him again, with more gratitude than he'd shown, and walked away. I heard the hole get covered, so I went over to Andrew, took him from the temporary place on the wall beside Candace, and replaced him at his usual spot. He protested, had apparently been in the middle of a conversation about sprucing up the room decor, but I wasn't in the mood. I went to my sleeping spot beneath Luke and Christopher, unrolled a sheet of paper, and started how it has become this entry. I'm afraid. I don't know what's going on or who this new person is, but I don't think I like him very much. He had an air of malice, a subtly menacing demeanor beneath his interest in my work, which I suspect is feigned. If he sincerely is interested, his motivations don't seem to be the same as those of the other man in the hole in the wall. I don't know what his game is, but I can tell I won't like him very much. Just hope that he treats my work with care. I will continue to write, if only for my own relief and distraction from the dismal circumstances. The faces are, of course, asking about today's latest visit, but I don't think I'll tell them what happened. I don't want to upset them and spoil the good cheer brought on by the day's earlier arrivals. I'll continue to hide these from my jailer, as I do not think that he'd approve of them. I don't want him stealing my work. It's all that I have left, since I don't have my freedom, or even my face. I hope tomorrow is better. Entry number 3 of Subject 6. He's taken all the faces. They're all gone. He didn't even leave me the one I'd been wearing. I have nothing. No face at all. My face flesh burns no matter what I do, no matter how much water I drink or how hard I try to sleep. The pain persists. It's maddening. I can't take it. Writing only helps a little, keeps my mind focused on something else, something just as immediate as the pain, but the pain is still here, eating away at my nerves, terrorizing me, and the light on the floor, the ever-present light beneath it, has gotten brighter. It's become nearly as intolerable as the pain, but I can't look away from it, because I need to write. Writing is all I have. Earlier today, while trying on all the faces so as to keep them from growing taut and unusable, there was a knock at the door. I was startled because he hadn't ever knocked before. He'd always just come in, take what he wanted, or give me something and leave. And as I was thinking that the new man in the hole in the wall had decided to visit me through different means, I scrambled to put on a presentable face, and then went to the door. But there's no knob on the door, no way for me to open it from inside, so I was only able to meekly call out, "Come in!" I hoped that he'd be able to enter from his side. The door opened slowly, gratingly, as if the opener wasn't accustomed to its cumbersome weight. I stepped back a little so to allow them some space to enter, and once the door was fully open, a figure stepped in. I didn't recognize the face. It belonged neither to him nor to the new man in the hole on the wall. It was a normal face, but plainly not that of its wearer. The skin of the face and the wearer were different colors. I'm not one to judge a person's desire to change themselves, so I held my tongue, and I greeted them as cordially as circumstances would allow. I'd just used the facilities of my little enclosure a few minutes prior, and hadn't thought to dump a fresh chunk of grime into the little waste hole. I hadn't been expecting guests, after all, and the faces never complained. Not to me, at least. I'm sure they gossiped amongst themselves. My guest didn't seem to mind, if he even smelled it at all, and greeted me politely, complimenting my face, which he said I had fitted upon myself very well. I thanked him, I offered him some wall water, but he politely declined, saying that he wasn't going to be staying for long. That he just wanted to ask if I'd like to go for a walk. I was utterly stunned. I hadn't ever been offered anything, let alone a walk outside my room. Suddenly the walls, perfectly circular and draped with tattered, blood-spattered and scarred faces, seemed oppressive, seemed suffocating. The floor now appeared to be, for the first time, disgustingly coated with grime and all manners of filth. The ceiling, unsettlingly dark and eerily immeasurable. Without hesitation, I shook my head in approval, and my guest stepped aside to allow me to walk out of the room. First. Immediately beyond the door was a long corridor, so dark and narrow that for a moment I thought that I had somehow begun walking skyward, still within my own room, which I still kind of believed to be some kind of well or deep pit. But upon hearing the door close behind me, I was assured of my forward progress into another area, and continued on down the lightless hall. I heard my guest following, so I saw no need to turn around, but something told me that if I were to glance behind me, I'd see something I wouldn't like. So I kept my borrowed face and natural eyes forward until I suddenly came to another door. This one strangely normal, not a thick slab of iron like the one that bars my room. Putting my hands on it, I felt that its surface was wood, and raised in the center, embossed with some kind of image. Its knob was cool, brass, and bulbous. Go on. Open it. Still unwilling to turn around, now feeling an instinctual perception of danger at the very idea, I obeyed the command and opened the door. It led into a room brightly lit for my eyes, which were, and still are, so accustomed to near complete darkness, by an old but luxurious chandelier affixed in the very center of the ceiling. It was a dining room of some kind, with an ovoid brown table, brown chairs, a few feet away from the door, and a cabinet of china and other dishes, apparently reserved for special occasions off to the side. There were wooden shelves on all the yellow papered walls, and most of them were occupied by framed pictures, but no two pictures held the same person, or set of people. There was a different person's portrait within each dust-befallen frame, and all strangely were positioned so that they faced the dining table, even if it required the frame to be precariously placed on the absolute edge of the shelf. The rooms smelled faintly of bread, pastries, the lingering scent of an earlier and undoubtedly pleasant meal. Go on. Have a seat. There was a sudden edge to my guest's, or rather, my host's, voice, so I quickly took a seat at the table just beside the china cabinet. My host sat across from me, his back to another door with decor similar to that of the previous one. The embossed image was that of a face larger than life, with a stern, almost fierce expression. There were no other entrances to the room besides the two doors, not even windows. Despite it being smaller, this room actually felt more spacious than mine. I suppose empty darkness can be just as physically confining as a cluttered yet well-lit space. For a few moments, we simply sat across from one another, looking at each other's false faces while saying nothing. Then my host cleared his throat and flatly laid his hands on the table, palms facing down. His shoulders rose and fell, slowly, deliberately, as if he were steadying his breathing to calm himself. I felt a weird sense of animosity from him, but couldn't figure out what I could have possibly done to anger him. As far as I knew, I hadn't met him before. The face was wholly unfamiliar. Finally, when he had apparently regained what he'd lost of his composure, he looked me in the eyes and said, "I know what you've been doing." His voice, which before had been as unfamiliar as his face, was now one I'd recognized. It was his voice. Up until that point, he had masked it perfectly. I hadn't at all suspected him to be the true identity of my host. Startled and suddenly feeling like I'd done something terribly wrong and was about to face a severe punishment, I raised my hands up above me as if there was a gun to my head and began sputtering out unfocused apologies, but he banged his hands on the table. Just once. But with enough force and violence that I immediately dropped my hands, shut my mouth, and went still. I was beyond terrified. He hadn't ever become violent with me, and I, weirdly, felt extremely uncomfortable and vulnerable within that room. Even though it offered more means of protection and escape than my own. My brother thought you'd be an interesting study, so I allowed him to sit with you. Had meant for him to just have one session, a little interview, but he became enamored and went behind my back to conduct another. I do not allow anyone to visit my subjects with any sort of frequency, and my brother was no exception. I had to rid myself of him. Violations of policy cannot be tolerated from anyone. And while curious, aren't worthy of rewriting policy, of making needless exceptions. So in a way, you killed my brother. I was just the tool that carried out the deed. I was floored. I hadn't thought for 1 second that there could be a familial connection between the two men. Had simply assumed that my room was some sort of nexus for other random places, and that the man in the hole in the wall had been a random visitor. I guess the environment of my room, my diet of unidentifiable gunk, it messed with my mind. Looking him in the eye with as much sincerity as I could express through my now misaligned face, I said that I was sorry, that I hadn't meant to cause his brother's death. He regarded me dispassionately for a while, shifting his own face to suit his preferences, and finally clapped his hands together and said, "Well, no matter. What's done is done. Forgive and forget. But a punishment must follow. And while my brother has received his, you have not received yours." For a moment, my heart seemed to cease its beating, and my soul felt frigidly chilled as if blasted by some boreal wind. But just before panic could swell up and consume me, he pronounced my fate, which was not to be murdered, but something nearly as bad. With his smoldering dark eyes, he said, "I'm going to take all of your faces." I cried, even audibly protested, not caring if the tantrum would result in some physical reprimand, but he simply sat and patiently waited, and when the fire had died in my chest, I sat back in my seat and sulked. And after a few moments of this, he gestured for me to rise and head back towards the corridor. I complied. I went to the door I had come through. I ventured back into the lightless hall. I'm back in my room now. He took all the faces down one by one, and their confusion and protests were just awful to hear. Candace was particularly frightened. I almost begged him to let me keep her, but I knew that in doing so I'd only make the others feel worse. Lastly, he came over and took the one I'd put on my face to meet him, leaving me with absolutely nothing. His parting remark was that I could still write if I'd like to, and that he'd still carry out his brother's mission. Sullenly, I said that I would. And so I have. The light beneath me, while brighter now, still can't cast enough light to show me what lies above. In the deeply darkened shadows, but I feel like there's something new there, something I hadn't before perceived. I feel uncomfortable, vulnerable. More so than usual, I have a lot to think over and a lot to digest. Based on my conversation with him in that nicely furnished room, I don't think I'm the only one being kept here in this dungeon, compound, whatever this is. My abduction must have happened 2 or 3 weeks ago by now, and yet I haven't met a single other imprisoned person. Only those 2 men and the faces. And now with my only benefactor dead, and my faces taken, I'm more alone than ever. I have no reason to hide the papers anymore, so I guess I'll just leave this entry by the door when I'm finished. There's no point in putting them through the hole in the wall anymore. No one is there to receive them. Good night. Journal entry number 4 of subject 6. While tidying up my room, there wasn't much else to do, with the faces all gone. I happened to catch a glimpse of something in the floor, through its light. It had been almost blinding to look at in the hours since its seeming source light was strengthened. Without eyelids, I had to face the faceless walls while sleeping. But for a second, I caught sight of something in that ultra-luminous depth. An object of some kind, vaguely round, maybe 20 or 30 feet deep, far below the surface of the floor. I had never really regarded it as a transparent or translucent thing. I'd always viewed it as a solid surface from which light somehow emitted. But I knew then, came to realize with a sudden and undoubtable certainty, that the floor was merely a transparent level, beneath which existed something else. But I could only see the unknown object from a specific perspective, just beneath Greg's spot on the wall. Standing here facing the wall with my back flat, as flat as it can be to a curved surface, against the wall and looking at an angle of about 60 degrees from my feet, I could see within the floor the object. Moving anywhere else obscured it in the harsh light, and trying to visibly focus on it also forced me to focus on the light, which subsequently made it harder to see the object. It was confounding, frustrating, and after maybe 5 minutes of trying to figure out what it was, I gave up and I went back to cleaning. While scraping gunk into the waste hole, a thought came to me. What if I tried to see something in the ceiling, following the same principle that perhaps there was something to see from a particular perspective, vantage? So I went to the center of the room, looking up, and I began walking around, first in a circular pattern, then in straight lines in the center in every direction. Walking forward, backward, trying all kinds of bodily positions, but I didn't see anything after about 20 minutes, and I gave up on the endeavor. I cleaned up about as much as I could, so I went to my stack of thick leathery papers, intending to draw. I hadn't been forbidden from drawing. The idea hadn't occurred to me until then, but something about it, when I put the pen onto the paper, suddenly felt wrong. Or rather, incompatible. As if I couldn't draw rather than shouldn't. But I knew that I had always enjoyed doodling, and I tried to focus, to really think of something to draw. But no matter how hard I thought, nothing developed. My pen hovered uselessly above the paper. Vehemently embittered and more than a little frightened, At the unexplainable inability to simply draw, I threw the pen and paper away from me. I watched the pen roll across the floor while papers fluttered haphazardly above the floor. A few droplets of the wall water fell onto the paper that had come to settle, staining them blackly. I never wondered why the water was black. I simply drank it, attributing its color to some admixture of sediment from the walls or above. It hadn't yet killed me, or even made me sick, so why wonder? But with everything gone, with my life falling apart for a second time, and that aggravating, inexorable light always in my face, I started to wonder, to really question my surroundings and situation for the first time. The delirium and dumb complacency that had persisted, gnawed at my mind and prevented me from thinking clearly, suddenly receded, and I was able to really take stock of my surroundings and be appropriately horrified by them. With a choking shock, I realized the utter state of decadence and squalor in which I had been living. Saw, almost with new eyes, the stinking, grime-encrusted hole a few feet from the heavy iron door in which I had for weeks deposited my bodily waste. I shrank away from the now oppressive walls, whilst also coming to newly and deeply fears of looming, cavernous darkness above. And detesting with a mounting revulsion the unwholesome subterranean light beneath my unspeakably dirty feet. It was a pit of torture, and I had stupidly called it my room, had hung the blood-spattered and wretched faces of dead people on its obsidian, grime-coated walls. And the faces. Oh God, the faces. I had worn them on my own. Well, not my face, on the subdermal flesh, pink and raw beneath it. My face had been stolen from me, taken by my sadistic jailer, and in exchange, he'd given me the faces, some hideously figured, others frozen in expressions of black terror as some kind of sick reparation for his abominable act. And I, driven insane by my predicament, had hung them on the disgustingly adhesive walls. I'd spoken to them, given them new names, personalities, and worst of all, I applied them to my head, and I'd worn them as masks to appear presentable to the very same men who had stripped me of my identity, of my freedom. A compounding realization, this sudden and awful self-awareness were too much. I fell into my knees, gripping my raw face and screaming, not merely or even largely from the pain of the contact, but from the utter deplorable fate and cruelty to which I'd been subjected. I hadn't even in my life done anything to deserve such violence, such malice. I can't think of anyone who has. And that final and perhaps the most perplexing question came to me. How am I alive? Setting aside the fact that I had subsisted on strange black water and its gunk-like deposits for who knows how long, how had I not succumbed to an infection born of my raw flesh being exposed to an abysmally unhygienic environment? My nasal cavities, my eyes, my mouth, they all should have been horribly, incurably infected and rotting days or weeks ago, and yet while there had been pain, it's always tremendous pain, I had lived through it all. Lived with the necrotic tissue of over a dozen people affixed to my face, each for hours at a time. It was unreal, biomedically impossible. Coeval of this final self-directive and importantly unspoken inquiry, the light again brightened, becoming an almost tangible force from which I couldn't even turn away. It filled the room, becoming a mounting, phontic wave of physical sensation which rattled my bones with the sheer strength of its radiance. I was quickly bathed in its awful illumination, as if the Earth's core had grown by several magnitudes. I writhed on the floor, unable to look away, unable to bear the omnipresent, agonizing light, and I was only spared from an even greater insanity by the sight above me, the newly illuminated ceiling of my abyssal pit center. In a moment of breathlessness, I watched its figure slowly resolved in the diminishing darkness. The once veiling shadows swept away by the still mounting light. A loud, sorrowful moan that escaped my lips, a wail of incredulity, terror, and grief, all rolled into one. Figures of people, naked, hanging upside down by their ankles, their faceless heads swaying, dripping some strange black liquid. There were dozens, perhaps hundreds of them, swinging, gently rocking against one another from the soft vibrations of some unseen machinery or geological activity. Somehow the clanking of their chains had remained inaudible to me all this time. Somehow the collective corpse funk, putrid beyond expression, had not reached my nose until that very moment. Now the truth has been revealed to you. What will you do now? Come see me when you're able. The voice came from above, from beyond the carelessly suspended corpses. For a brief moment, I thought that one of them had spoken. But the sound of my door opening quelled the hysteria that would have shortly arisen from that thought. I turned away from the macabre sight. I was absolutely terrified, and knew that something darkly, horribly momentous was happening, but couldn't figure out what, and knew that the only way to get answers would be to play along, to let the horrible sequence of events continue. Far more afraid than I had ever been, I left my room, entering the second time that pitch-black corridor. This time it was lit by torches, intermittently placed along both walls. There was nothing of real interest illuminated by their sallow light, but the overall impression was one of baleful expectancy. They seemed to augur some horrible fate, ushering me along with their strangely flickering flames. I hurried down the length of the corridor, wanting to reach my destination and end the awful anxiety. The room beyond had not changed. It was still the same incongruously homely dining room, something which looked like it had been transplanted from a nice countryside farmstead. The only strange thing about it were the framed pictures, all of apparent strangers. None of them looked alike, all positioned to face the dining table, a table that could never accommodate such a large gathering. My host was not here, so I continued on to the other door, the one I hadn't gone through during my previous visit. I was briefly disturbed by the embossed image of the massive face, because for a moment I thought that it had moved, still shifting its austere expression in some almost imperceptible way, but my mind quickly decided that I was only succumbing to the psychological effects of rattled nerves, and I quickly ignored the image. I reached for the knob, I opened the door, and I found myself staring into another hallway. This one artificially lit by regular lights, panels on the ceiling. The walls were covered in the same yellow wallpaper that covered the dining room, and were similarly faded, of an unguessable age. There was no furniture in this hall, no decorations, just a dilapidated yellowness that verged on being dismal, eerie even. At the other end was a forked path, one hall leading to my right, another to my left, with a framed picture of some stranger on the wall at their junction. The portrait, while in black and white, vaguely resembled the face embossed on the doors of the dining room. The severe expression glared at me with an air of almost puritanical judgment. There were black candles on a silver tray beneath it, 3 of them of equal size, all lit with little white flames. I sensed an importance in the man's appearance, and an impression I gained more so from the image itself rather than its seemingly reverent placement in the hall. Take the path on the left, please. I obeyed the voice, which now sounded omnipresent, rather than originating from some hidden speaker. I continued on down the left hall. At the end of this was a door, similar in build to the one that sealed my room. Gripping the heavy iron handle, I wrenched it open and found myself staring into a room not dissimilar to my own, albeit much cleaner. Its walls were not slick with grime, its floor, while lit, was not harshly radiant, and there was no corpses that I could see, suspending from its ceiling. There was, however, a short stone pedestal at the center of the room on which sat something I immediately recognized. My face. The skin had been preserved very well, and the wounds I'd been inflicted with during my capture were virtually unnoticeable. The light from the floor illuminated the face brilliantly, making it seem like some prize at the end of a long, nightmarish ordeal. I had almost forgotten what I looked like. I'd grown so accustomed to wearing the faces of others that mine almost seemed like a stranger's. I wanted to rush to it, to put it on and revel in the reacquisition of my identity, but there was a sudden sound behind me. And turning around, I saw him. I knew it was him. Despite the mask he was wearing, his figure, immediately recognizable in my renewed mental clarity, was sickly, yet somehow imposing, having in his frame a sense of authority. His hunched shoulders, bent arms, head perpetually cocked to the side, the same figure as the man in the hole in the wall. Nakedly wearing only the mask, he closed the door and stepped into the scope of the floor's soft light. When I got a clear view of the mask, I had a sudden rush of emotion, a powerful surge of familiarity, but I couldn't place the face. I couldn't recall which of my friends it had been. The man continued on past me, going to stand beside the pedestal. He gestured to my face with an air of showmanship, as if presenting some rare and costly artifact to an audience of bidders. With this, you can reclaim your identity. You can take back yourself and leave this place. The nightmare will end, and you'll be free. You need only to pick it up and apply it to your face. It'll conform to your features, it'll seamlessly reattach itself. I'll then escort you out. Or, and he gestured to his own face here, you may have this one. This beautiful, painstakingly carved collage of faces. An amalgamation of all those with whom you have developed such beautiful friendships. They're all here, in some way. An eye, a brow, a lip, a freckle, a mole, a whisker, a strand of hair, a patch of skin. Everyone is here, in this face, stitched together. And if you choose to, you may forsake your boring, ordinary face, cast it into the dark, and wear this one. You could join this beautiful collective. The idea, of course, was ludicrous to me. At first, I laughed, almost insanely. But then the light dimmed, and the darkness above seemed to grow, to become more fulsome, and the mask, the composite one, somehow seemed more appealing, more attractive in the increasing dimness. I remembered all the conversations I'd had with the faces, all imagined, of course, but conversations I had nonetheless enjoyed. I remembered Candace and Andrew's begrudging friendship, Greg's incurable bitterness, Hector's musings on love and the tireless march of time. I inescapably found myself strangely nostalgic over isolation-born delusions, over remembrances of madness. Against reason and logic and all notions of self-preservation, I motioned for him to give me the amalgamate mask. And like a historian dealing with a priceless antique, he gently removed it from his face and placed it on my eagerly outstretched hands. With comparable, if not greater care, I placed it on my face and smoothed it out so that it rested firmly and comfortably on my flesh. The sensation, unlike before, not was painful, but rather the opposite. There was a calming effect. Almost narcotic in nature, the mask smelled of chemicals, of flowers, of other unnameable things, but not of death and decay, as the others had smelled. The pain that ever persisted, the agony of my faceless flesh being exposed to the dungeon-like environment, it was also suppressed upon affixing the mask to the muscle and bone. And all at once, the faces spoke to me, telling me of their time away, how frightened they had been, how wonderful it felt to be joined together in one beautiful image. I listened, smiling along with them, and I heard dimly the departure of the man, of my generous mask maker. He must have come sometime later, because after I removed the face to drink some water, I didn't want to stain it. I saw a pile of papers, the thick, skin-colored pages I'd left behind in my own room. There was a note attached which said, "Continue your work here if you'd like. This can be your new room. It's much cleaner. I'm sure you'll find it to your liking." And I do. I do like it. There's none of the rampant filth and decay. The light from the floor is dim, barely noticeable. The darkness above like a shadowy blanket. Also, incredibly, I can wear the new amalgamate mask for as long as I want without feeling any pain, or even the mildest discomfort. It's perfectly suited to me. Better than my own face was. And now I needn't soil the faces by hanging them on the walls. They can all feel equally appreciated. No one is left out. Everyone has a voice, a chance to speak, a chance to be worn. As I write this, they can see the words forming on the pages. They could provide input or ask for clarification. We're all in this together. We all wear the same face. Hey there kids, it's me, MrCreepyPasta, and I wanted to tell you thank you for watching today's video on YouTube or listening to tonight's episode of the podcast. If you guys are watching on YouTube, then that means you can find the podcast on Spotify or anywhere else that you happen to listen to podcasts. And if you guys are listening on the podcast, hey, if you want to find some older episodes or a whole bunch of stories you've never seen before, you should check out youtube.com/MrCreepyPasta. And no matter where you are, I really appreciate you hitting that subscribe button and hitting that bell reminder, just so that you can always find a new story as soon as it becomes available. And I want to give a big thank you, as always, to all of my Patreon subscribers on Patreon. All my patrons on Patreon. You guys are the real MVPs. You're the ones that allow me to do stuff like getting specific stories just for the channel. All those wonderful things that come from Dale Drake, those are because of all of you. If you guys want to see more of that, then I would really, really, really love if you guys could help support on patreon.com/MrCreepyPasta, like some of these wonderful guys, such as Jordan Alexander Sanchez, Stephanie Butler, Bobby Karman, Tristain Pelton, Chance Burnett, Diana Kraus, KhaosArts, Kryolinian, Milk and Miel, Celty K. Sturloson, Zachary, Graffius, It's All About That FOOKIN Music, Goreng, Trimagasi, Maria Walker, Tonya, Oran, paingravy, Krazy Kid, MrMarcusBlitz, Aika, Limchoc, Dirt Diver 030, Matt Bach, Jabbles, Raz, Voiceofsand, Coffee Zombie, Matthew McNeese, Shelly J, Jeremy H, Raltazal, Ficomel, Nana, Nick Weaver, Milton Lake, Tolly Sue, Sky Mara Ravenswood, William King, Darth Milver, Micah Ortiz, Satanic Aries, Nessie, Barterhawk 764, Lambda M98, Harley, Billy Morrow, Sashi Suzaku, My Body Sounds Like Rice Krispies, Kaylee Ambrose, Suji Campbell, Stricken, Azarine Fox, Freddy Krueger, Nicholas Zaccardi, Happy Birthday Jason Wilson, Lisa Cottrell, Caspian, Hades Nephew, Tater Chip, Acid System, Prozac and Pancake Appreciation Society, Cryptic Nightmares, Kiri the Sloth, Tommy Green, Fester Lampshade, Sky Harbor, Nico Kyle, Rafael Rodriguez, The Ginger Bros, Aaron Stormcrow, Daniel Paulson, Trace Miles, and Corey Kenshin. You guys, as well as everybody if you look down in the description, and everybody that can even just give $1 to be able to help things out. I really appreciate it. If you guys would like to join this list of names that I horribly, horribly mispronounce, check out patreon.com/MrCreepyPasta. And honestly, even you guys who just listen, you watch, you comment, you like, you subscribe, thank you all. I really appreciate it. And sweet dreams.